Greek mythology is often presented as grand, heroic, and full of shining gods and brave warriors. But beneath the shimmering surface lies a world that was frankly miserable for most of its women. And when you look at the stories long enough, you start wondering how anyone ever slept peacefully after hearing them. Maybe that's why a boring, softened version is perfect for bedtime, where the drama is toned down and the outrageous unfairness becomes something you can drift off to rather than rage about. To begin with, the gods themselves were exhorting. Zeus alone could keep an entire insomniac population occupied with his endless schemes, disguises, and impulsive decisions, most of which ended terribly for the women involved. If you lived in those stories, you would spend half your time worrying a cloud might actually be Zeus, or that a random golden shower wasn't just rain. So being a woman meant existing in a constant state of please go away, I just want to live. Hera, the queen of the gods, might seem like an ally at first glance, but she was mostly too busy hunting down the women Zeus tricked, cursed, or charmed to bother offering comfort or support. Instead of addressing the actual problem, her husband, she lashed out at the innocent, making the women doubly unlucky for having attracted divine attention in the first place. Imagine trying to live quietly and suddenly being turned into a cow, a bird, a tree, or something equally inconvenient simply because a couple of immortals were having marital issues above your pay grade, and then having to continue life like that was perfectly normal. Even mortal men weren't much help. Heroes strutted around with swords, shields, and egos large enough to block the sunlight. Women were expected to watch, wait, weave, and hope the men came back in a reasonable amount of time, though most heroes either died dramatically, fell in love with someone else, or forgot they had promised anything in the first place. Penelope waited 20 years for Odysseus, which is bad enough. But imagine sitting there weaving the same cloth daily while fighting off suitors who refused to take a hint. That level of boredom alone could put anyone to sleep if you're hearing it at bedtime. Then there was the story of Helen, blamed for a war that lasted a decade, even though she never asked half the Greek world to fight over her. But that didn't matter, because women in Greek myths were often treated like objects people argued about, rather than actual human beings with choices. As a result, the dull and repetitive narrative of this terrible thing happened to a woman because some guy was upset becomes a sleepy drone when told without drama. If you take out the violent highlights and keep just the underlying pattern, it becomes a loop. Woman exists peacefully, man becomes jealous or greedy. Gods interfere, chaos happens, and the woman pays the price. Repeated enough times, it becomes almost hypnotic in its predictability. Like a badly written bedtime story someone keeps retelling because they don't know any new ones. Take Persephone, for example. The story is often told with dramatic underworld imagery, but if you strip it down to its basics, it's really just, girl takes a walk, someone sees her, decides he wants her, and she's dragged underground and forced into a seasonal marriage arrangement, which isn't exciting so much as depressing. Demeter's endless search for her daughter and her refusal to let the crops grow until Persephone was returned paints her as a frustrated mother dealing with the immortals' version of poor communication and terrible compromise. Told in a flat, bedtime tone, it becomes a cycle of Demeter looked for Persephone again, got tired, refused to grow wheat, and the gods held another meeting, repeated until your eyelids involuntarily droop. The monotony of divine bureaucracy really takes the thrill out of it. The same thing applies to stories like Medusa's, which in dramatic retellings is full of tragedy and horror. But when softened for sleep, becomes a woman, was wronged, then blamed, then turned into something scary, so heroes could feel impressive by defeating her. Which, while unfair, becomes almost dull when framed as just another example of the myth's recurring pattern of shifting blame onto women. After the 10th story like this, even a listener who isn't sleepy starts yawning simply because the narrative refuses to change. And then there's the whole theme of transformation. Women were constantly being turned into things, and it never seemed to happen for fun or empowerment. Daphne became a tree to escape Apollo. Io became a cow to avoid Hera. Callisto became a bear after being wronged. Arachne was turned into a spider for daring to be talented. And all of these follow roughly the same structure. Woman does something ordinary, A god notices. Something bad happens. Transformation occurs. Over time, the predictability creates a rhythm, almost like white noise. Misfortune, curse, transformation, repeat. It asks the mythological equivalent of listening to someone drone on about the same complaint with slightly different details each week. If you were lying down, listening to someone retell all these stories, back to back, in a quiet, slow, almost bored voice, you would drift off from sheer repetition. And the gods themselves, despite all their power, acted with the emotional intelligence of overly dramatic teenagers who could not handle rejection or slight inconveniences. A woman says no. Punish her. A mortal is too talented. Punish her. Someone is prettier than a goddess. Definitely punish her. That's how you end up with the story of Psyche, who was punished for being beautiful even though she didn't ask to be admired. When recounted in a slow, flat tone, the story becomes a kind of endless cycle of errands, tasks, misunderstandings, and miscommunications that eventually lull the listener into a quiet acceptance that this is just how Greek mythology works. Even the women who seemed powerful often weren't. Their stories were shaped by jealousy, revenge, or the whims of more powerful men. Clytemnestra, who lived through betrayal after betrayal, is usually portrayed as vengeful and dangerous. But if you frame the events plainly, the story becomes a long list of grievances that never improve, turning her into one more woman pushed into an impossible situation. And that's the core of Greek myths. Women placed in impossible situations with no control, no justice, and no real choices. It's not exciting when softened, it's just a parade of tired patterns. And you almost feel sleepy imagining how exhausting it would be to live through all that while knowing you couldn't do anything about it. Even the goddesses weren't free. Athena was wise, but still bound by loyalty to Zeus. Aphrodite had to play the role assigned to her. Artemis had strict rules that caused tragedies whenever someone accidentally broke them. When these stories are told without the fiery drama, without the booming battles and flashy magic, they flatten into gentle, repetitive fables about how unfair things were for women and how little changed from one tale to the next. The rhythm becomes slow, steady, almost meditative in its sameness, and before long, you find yourself sinking into a quieter state simply because your mind has stopped expecting anything new to happen. So when we talk about boring Greek myths for sleep and why it sucked to be a woman in Greek mythology, it becomes clear that the two ideas fit together naturally. If you take a world full of stress, injustice, and predictable patterns, mute the excitement, remove the tension, and retell it as though everything always unfolds in slow motion, you end up with a surprisingly effective lullaby. Not a happy one, not one that teaches a joyful lesson, but one that drifts on and on like a soft, repetitive tide, illustrating over and over how women in those stories were pushed to the edges, transformed, blamed, forgotten, or punished, until the very repetition of it becomes sleep-inducing. In the end, the myths themselves remain dramatic and powerful in their original form, but when distilled into a soft drone of monotony, woman suffers, gods argue. Nothing changes. They become something like ancient background noise for a restless night, a gentle reminder that even the stories that once thrilled audiences can turn into sleepy murmurs when stripped down to their weary repeating core.